out this plan. But, Raffles in his wildest dreams would not have envisaged that Singapore would be a very thriving city of 1.5 million by the late 50s, early 60s. In fact, while the British did a fairly good job, somehow they could not deal with the explosion of growth, especially after the war. And by the 50s and 60s, I think we became kind of a big problem in urbanization. We were overcrowded. Although we were only 1.5 million then, we were overcrowded. We had all sorts of urban ills like floods, we had droughts, we had crime, we had disease, whatever you name it, we kind of have it as a kind of almost a basket case of urbanization gone wrong. Fast forward, I think 50 years, you all know the story, Koon has told you very well. To today, we are kind of, in the last 4 or 5 decades, have done extremely well. Now, so we had a visionary by the name of Raffles. He did a very good job, but Singapore lasted perhaps 100 years under the strength of his vision and the plan that he came up with. Then somehow things kind of decayed a little bit. By the mid-60s, 70s, I think it called for a new wave of planning, urban development, and that, frankly, is what we have enjoying today, the last 4 or 5 decades of visionary leadership and planning. Now, we all know that, of course, Koon has given you some of these statistics also, that today we are kind of rated one of the more livable cities in the world. So our job in Center for Livable Cities, when the kind of Ministry of ND and Ministry of Environment and Water Resources got together 5 or 6 years ago to decide on, okay, how do we sustain what we have done so far over the last 4 or 5 decades in the face of climate change, in the face of changing demographics, aging population, many challenges, and yet, Singapore cannot grow beyond what we have already, the resource constraint of just an island and even very limited sea space. So the idea was that for us to sustain ourselves, of course, we have to keep on innovating, inventing, but we also need to look back a little bit into our past and try to understand what is it that we've done right and learn the principles and the lessons from what we have done right so that we can use these principles again as we look into the future to face the increasing challenges that we face in the future. And that's why the CLC, the Center for Livable Cities, was set up in 2008 as a center, really, as a knowledge center to distill, to create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. And our knowledge comes from what we call our stakeholder agencies, all the 22 government agencies that have been so involved in the development of Singapore over the last 4 or 5 decades and continue to be involved. HDB, URA, LTA, PUB, and so forth. And we do this not just looking at ourselves, but also try to learn and share from the rest of the world through our partnerships with the rest of the world. So that's his mission, if you like. And when we looked at what Singapore has done and ask ourselves the question, can we really be a relevant model for other cities? We came up with this matrix that we call it the Liveability matrix. And if you look at it, it's quite simple, really. Density of population on the vertical axis and livability. In this case, livability is by the Mercer Index. And you find that some of the most livable cities in the world are kind of on the bottom right-hand corner. So cities like Sydney, Vancouver, Stockholm, Melbourne, and so on. So they are very livable, but they are also very low density. In other words, fairly sprawling cities, very dependent on the car, if you like. Whereas there are very, very few cities that have developed in a very livable way, even though the city is very, very dense. Many dense cities are actually not very livable. I mean, we ourselves were not very livable even at a population of 1.5 million 4 or 5 decades ago. But in 50 years, our population has actually tripled, and yet we have become greener and more livable than ever before. So there is something there that we have done that is probably of value to other cities, especially in the developing world, in China, in India, in Latin America, later on probably Africa, where they will probably want to develop in a way that is more sustainable, and the model that perhaps we have seen in places like Vancouver, Sydney may not be the appropriate model for them. And therefore, I think we do have a role to play. We do have some value to other cities, especially developing cities in the world. Of course, for us, the challenge is beyond where we are. How do we continue to develop? Should we increase our density further? And the big challenge there, as articulated in the white paper earlier this year, is how do we, even as we grow, even as we try to manage our growth, slow down our growth, slow down our rate of population growth, we will still inevitably become denser. So the challenge for urban planners, challenge for people in HDB and parks is how do we continue to maintain our livability or even do better. So we kind of drew a little framework, we call it the CLC's livability framework, where we felt that in a way, if you try to distill the principles of what we have done over the last 40 to 50 years, it can be fairly simply represented in this diagram. We call it the livability framework, where we have been very focused on achieving livability outcomes, the what's, if you like. And I think Koon has shown this in the slide also, trying to balance quality of life for our citizens, but having to achieve economic growth because you need to earn a living and you need to provide jobs for people, while at the same time taking care of the environment. So how do you balance these three outcomes, especially in a place like Singapore where land is constrained, we don't even have enough water? That has been the kind of pressing challenge that we have had over the last 4 or 5 decades. And we felt that the sustaining of this livability has been really due to 2 very important factors, which are not so obvious. That's why this diagram is drawn with a light blue on top and a dark blue below. The light blue represents the sky, the atmosphere. The dark blue is what is underneath the surface, and it's not so obvious. And that's integrated planning and development. A lot of what the agencies are doing, whether it's HDB, URA, PUB, and so on. But this integrated planning and execution of our work could only have been possible in an environment where we had good governance, good leadership, good framework of laws, involvement of the private sector and the community. And it's that enables the professionals in the different agencies to be able to plan and execute and make things happen in Singapore in a sustained way. So that's kind of a very simple oversimplification of what really has accounted for what Singapore has achieved in the last 4 or 5 decades. And if we are going to be able to do this in the future, we think that it's important we don't forget these principles and continue to apply them in dealing with the new challenges that we have. And also in trying to be a model to other cities. I think the important thing to tell them to do is not to copy what Singapore has done, but to kind of bear in mind these principles which are important for livability and sustainability. So the rest of my slides, I think a lot of it duplicate what Koon has already shown you. So planning, Raffles had his 1829 Jackson plan. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had the foresight and really also the humility, I suppose, to invite the United Nations to come in and help Singapore. It was such a big problem, but he also was able to see the value of what the UN team came up with, the concept plan in 1971, got a team of local planners, including former President Ong Teng Cheong, to work with the UN and came out with this. When you think about it, this was done in between 1967 and 71, and they envisaged at that point in time, and remember the condition Singapore was in at that point in time, overcrowded, 1.5 million, and they envisaged a population of 3.4 million. They envisaged Singapore having an MRT, they envisaged number of new towns, expressways. It was really, really visionary at its time. In fact, if this was published as a white paper at that point in time and they asked the citizens, I think they probably would have seen this as crazy because we are already overcrowded, 1.5 million. How can you be planning for a population of 3.4 million? But they did that, and I think the rest is history in the sense that over the years we have kind of, in a way, added on and improved this plan, 1991 and 2001, and the latest one is 2012, 2011. So basically, I think our approach to development has been one, as I said, where we try to balance the 3 outcomes of